everyone to Daf Yomi, 1 week at a time, Masechet Kiddushin. Today is our third lesson, and today we're going to be reviewing Daf 18 to 24. Now, if you remember, we started the whole Masechet discussing how the woman is acquired, meaning how she is betrothed. And from there, the chapter is going to continue to discuss how different either people or possessions are acquired. Since we're talking about acquisition. Again, as we mentioned before, when a woman is betrothed, it's not ownership, but other things are. And we're kind of going in, I guess we'll say, descending order. The next thing that we're going to be discussing on Daf 18 is when a person purchases, and I use air quotes on purpose, a Jewish servant or slave, an Eved Ivri. It is important to understand that he is not owned by the master in the sense of a possession. He is a servant. He must serve his time, but we're going to see that the Eved Ivri, the male Jewish servant, he goes free after 6 years, meaning his time is limited, or if the Yovel, the Jubilee year, comes before the 6 years are up, or when his master dies, meaning he is not passed down. We will see soon that a non-Jewish slave is seen as owned completely by the master and is passed down to the inheritors. The female Jewish slave, this is called an Amma Ivriya, a Jewish maidservant. She goes free when she shows sign of puberty, meaning she can only be in this status till she reaches 12 years old. She cannot be sold again, and she can be redeemed against his will. The master can marry the Jewish maidservant. Again, the idea here is that the father sold her with the express idea or intention that the master will either marry her or marry her off to his son. And we'll see all of this. Now, if the master wants to marry her, he does what's called ye'ud. Ye'ud is the betrothal process of the master to his Jewish maidservant. And we'll see what it means in a minute. Therefore, she doesn't go free, meaning she becomes a wife. And if he does ye'ud, so then she needs a get in order to get out of that relationship. If he doesn't do ye'ud, then she goes free in all the ways that we mentioned. The Jewish slave how does he get to this status? If he, let's say, stole from a person and he could not pay the principal back, he is sold to that person to make up the value that he owes. Let's say the person stole again, he could be sold again if he cannot pay back what he stole. The Gemara now talks about if he stole a certain value. Let's say he stole 1,000 shekel, and let's say he's only worth 500 shekel. So then he sold twice, meaning he pays or he works two, as we said, 6-year periods. If he stole 500 and he's worth 1,000, so then he's not sold, meaning there's no such thing as working half. Or no, he is if he's worth half and he has to pay double, he's only sold once and not twice. That's a machloket in the Gemara. we said that the Ama Ivriya, the Jewish maidservant, can be redeemed against his will. So now the Gemara asks, what does that mean, his will? Whose will? Is it the master's will or against the father's will? So the Gemara says, let's say it's the master's will, but the same thing is with a Jewish servant, a male servant. So what's the difference? So then the Gemara says, you're right, it must be that we're talking about the father. Again, the father is the one who sold her. So the Gemara says we can force the father to redeem her, or maybe anyone can redeem her, meaning it doesn't have to be the father, it could be anyone else. And the father cannot sell her again. If he sold her once, that's it. Also, once he marries her off, let's say she gets divorced or is widowed, he cannot sell her into slavery again. Okay. Now the Gemara asks, we mentioned this concept of Ye'ud. The question is Ye'ud a betrothal, right? Is it comparable to Kiddushin, or is it Nisu'in? Is it how he marries her? And again, it depends what, it depends what the mechanism is. It has different ramifications. So there are two opinions. One is that it's betrothal, and one is that it's actually marriage. There's a machloket if the father can sell her to someone that she cannot marry. Remember, we said when he sells his daughter, the assumption is that the master is going to marry her. What if he cannot marry her? Meaning, let's say it's a relative or someone she's not allowed to marry. The Gemara continues and asks, what if the master wants to do, when the master wants to do Ye'ud, so the money that he gave the father to buy her originally doesn't count as part of the Ye'ud process. He needs to free her, and then he gives her money. We said that we asked if the father can sell her to someone she cannot marry. So the Gemara teaches us that the father can sell his daughter to the high priest, to the Kohen Gadol, after she is widowed. So that seems to imply that he can sell her to someone who cannot do Ye'ud for her. Daf 19 asks, can the master do Ye'ud for his son, even if the son is a minor? And the Gemara says, no, the son has to be an adult, and therefore then the father can do Ye'ud for his son, or maybe no, he can do it even if the son is a minor. And then the Gemara says, no, it has to be that the son is an adult. Again, we can only do Ye'ud if everyone consents to it. It cannot be done without consent. As we said, the original payment isn't used for betrothal. He needs to tell her that he wants to marry her, meaning there needs to be a discussion where she consents. Or the Gemara says maybe you can use the money from the original sale, but he has to tell her that this is what he wants to do. He has to do, the question is, when does he do Ye'ud? As Zohar wrote, designation. When does he do this? It has to be with enough time for her to acquire herself, meaning she has to still be in servitude to him, and it has to be that she has at least a value of a pruta, which is the smallest amount of money, left in her service. Because once she is freed or she finishes her service, he cannot do it anymore. A person can betroth a woman with the collateral of a loan. So that's important to understand that it could be, even though it's not necessarily money, it does have value, and therefore he can betroth a woman with that. How does the master, do Ye'ud? He says, like we had in Kiddushin, in betrothal, Harei at mikudeshet li, right? I want you to be betrothed to me. He can even do it, as we mentioned, on the last day of her service, even in the last hour, and then she becomes his full-fledged wife. Or, as we said, you need to leave some time of the day worth at least a pruta, but if not, then it is not valid. The Gemara gives an option that the original money he bought her with is the beginning of the betrothal process, and it only goes into effect at the end. Let's say the father sold his daughter to Reuven, to one person, and then accepted betrothal from Shimon, from another person. So now the question is, what's going on? Right? So one opinion is she's betrothed to Shimon because he accepted Kiddushin. That's stronger than the sale. Or the sages say that if, right, he has an option. If Reuven wants to do Yi'ud, he can, meaning he can betroth the maidservant. He has the first option. And if not, then she can go to Shimon. Let's say a father sells his daughter and tells the master, you can't do Yi'ud, meaning you cannot marry my daughter. Does that work or not? The Gemara says it does work. It is valid. It's a valid condition. Remember, we discussed if Kiddushin can have conditions. So we see here that it can. The Gemara says another opinion is no. This is a biblical condition, meaning the Torah said that if a man buys a female servant, it has to be with the condition that he could marry her. And therefore, the father cannot negate that condition that the Torah already put in place. Again, that's the question is, can the father sell her only to be a maidservant and not with the potential to be a wife? And here the Gemara discusses that the father can sell her to his relatives, even though they can't marry her. And this is learned from a verse. Again, another opinion on Daf 20 is she cannot be sold to the relatives. It has to be that the master can marry the maidservant. Okay, and he can sell her. The Gemara asks if he can sell her to, can the father sell her to his father or to his son? Again, people who cannot marry her. One opinion is no, definitely not to his son. Maybe the grandfather can buy the granddaughter because he can give her to his other son. This reminds us of Masechet Yevamot, where the uncle can marry his niece, and therefore that would be okay. From here, the Gemara teaches us that the Eved Ivri, the Jewish servant, does not go free if he was injured. We're going to learn soon that the non-Jewish slave does go free if he is injured. Let's say the Jewish slave came into slavery again, or servitude, I guess I think is a better term. Let's say he was married with children. His master can make him sleep with a non-Jewish slave that he owns in order to produce more slaves. If he was not married beforehand, he cannot make him. If the servant wants to redeem himself, we are lenient and we accept the lowest value. If you remember, the only reason he sold himself or was sold was because he couldn't pay a debt. If he can pay it back, he can redeem himself. Again, we go by the lowest value, either his current value or the value when he was sold. The Gemara teaches us that the master has to treat his Jewish servant like himself, meaning if he's eating chicken for dinner, the servant must eat chicken for dinner. If he's drinking good wine, he has to give him good wine. So we see that we are very lenient. We'll see even more in a few minutes. Okay, the Gemara tells us that as an aside, if you sell produce of Shvi'it of the 7th year, which you're not allowed to do, you're trying to make money, you're gonna end up very poor. And if you continue doing sins, you won't even realize that you need to do tshuva, that you need to repent for these sins. Very appropriate for this time period when we're thinking about repentance. And why is this mentioned? Because you're going to be so poor that you're going to need to sell your daughter, and then you're going to need to borrow money with interest, and then you're still not going to do tshuva, you're still not going to repent, and you'll end up having to sell yourself, right? So we see that there's this downward spiral of things, one thing that leads to another. And then you have to be very stringent, but the Gemara says, no, we are lenient with the servant, even though he ended up in this very terrible position. If the Jewish servant is sold to a non-Jew, he can pay half of the value, and the Gemara asks, can he pay half of the value and only work half of the time? Right? Is it learned from the field, which is ancestral field? There is an ancestral land that is redeemed only with the full value and not with half the value. Now, again, we're going to mention certain things that are related in certain ways. One is the ancestral field that is passed down through generations. Let's say you don't have enough money to keep it, you have to sell it. How do we redeem it? How do we buy it back? The Gemara is going to talk about it. And we have the servant, the Jewish servant that is also sold and needs to be redeemed. We're going to see that there are certain similarities and certain differences. Again, we don't think that a person is like a field, but there are similarities. So we're going to go back and forth to see if we can compare the two things. So I'm going to summarize this discussion, but I brought this chart if you want to see the chart. I'm not going to go through all of the details, but we'll see how each thing has certain strengths in these redemption laws. So again, we're trying to understand if a slave or a servant who is Jewish can be redeemed halfway. We went to the field that is sold. That is only redeemed fully, not in half. That's the last column here. Redeemed by half. It says no. Okay, let's say he pays half his value, and then at the end, does he pay the other half? Let's say he went up in value. So now the Gemara is going to talk about another thing. Let's say a person sells his home that is in a walled city. These homes that were in a walled city need to be, you have a year to redeem it. Right, that's the second and the third column. The earliest time you can redeem it and the latest time you can redeem it, you have a year to redeem it. Let's say, again, can you redeem it in half, meaning half of its value? The Gemara says, no, you cannot. And then the last category is a field that was consecrated, that was sanctified, mukdash, like hekdesh. That's our second thing here on the chart. This chart, by the way, is from the Art Scroll Gemara. So thank you, Art Scroll. So the Gemara asks, can a consecrated field be redeemed in half? You see, that's the question mark, right? And can we redeem the house in halves or not? And we, of course, said that the Gemara says no, but it actually is a machloket. So at the top of Daf 21, the Gemara tells us how each thing has its strength, right? To redeem a field that was sold versus consecrated versus the house. As I mentioned, all of them have certain stringencies. Again, you can see the chart for the stringencies. And the question is if we can learn one from the other. Again, we look at the similarities. In the Gemara, it's called Hatzad Hashaveh. We look for the side that is equal, right? Again, each one is unique, but what is equal? They are all redeemed, but they cannot be redeemed with money that you borrowed or by half, right? Again, as you see, two of them cannot be redeemed by half. Therefore, the field that is consecrated cannot be redeemed by half, right? We say that all of them, right, one teaches to the other. Or we say, no, both the sold field and the house can be redeemed after 2 years, but the consecrated field can be redeemed at any time. Therefore, we cannot learn one from the other. So that's just, again, if it was too complicated, that's why I brought the chart. I think just the key here is that we are drawing parallels between different things that have certain things that are parallel and certain things that are different. Okay, the Eved Ivri, again, the Jewish slave that's sold to a non-Jew, can be redeemed in the second year, but again, he cannot borrow money to redeem himself, or he can redeem himself in half, as we mentioned before. That was the beginning of our entire discussion. The house in the walled city can only be redeemed by the original owner, but not his relatives. I have another chart for you if you like to see the flow. This is a little small, but this is the flow of the Gemara going through each unique, though maybe similar discussion of each thing that I just mentioned. So again, I'm going to summarize it. If you want to read it through, you can look at the chart. A regular house, meaning a house that's not in a walled city, and the Jewish slave can be redeemed by relatives. As I mentioned, the house in the walled city can only be redeemed by the original owner. It is important, I'll just take a second to discuss, the house in the walled city is unique because, again, walled cities need to be protected, and therefore they always need to have an owner. Therefore, you have less time to redeem it, meaning if you don't redeem it, someone else will buy it or continues to own it. So it's different. A walled city is different than a regular city. Let's say a person sells his ancestral land. The relatives have the ability to redeem it. And here the Gemara discusses, is it the ability to redeem it or an obligation to redeem it? And that is a machloket on Daf 21. Right, the Torah says to redeem 3 times, and therefore this teaches that all things can be redeemed by relatives, meaning all the different categories that we just mentioned. The Eved Ivri that's sold, the Jewish slave that's sold to a Jew, can a relative redeem him? The Gemara says no, because he's going to be freed in 6 years. Therefore, he can stay in his servitude for those 6 years. The Torah teaches that a slave can stay longer if he has to do a certain ceremony by piercing his right ear. In the Torah, this is called the nirtzah. Nirtzah, ritziah means to be pierced. So let's say this man says I really don't have a lot of money. I liked it here. The master was very good to me. I want to stay. So the Torah says he stays forever. But the Torah also says he goes free in the Yovel year, in the Jubilee year, in the 50th year. So he goes free in that year, or if the master dies, he goes free. The Gemara teaches how is this done? He can be pierced by anything, or maybe only by a metal object. This is a discussion because the Torah says it has to be a metal object. The Gemara here says it could be actually anything sharp. You pierce the earlobe. Or maybe you pierce the upper cartilage, because again, one creates a mum, a blemish, where the other one doesn't. And the Gemara says you can use anything except for like a corrosive material. It needs to be something that actually pierces the ear. Okay, the Gemara from here talks about what's called the Eshet Yifat Toar. This is the female captive that's taken from battle. We actually learned about it last week's Parsha. No, 2 weeks ago, 2 weeks ago's Parsha. This is when a soldier goes out to war and he sees a beautiful captive, he can take her. He cannot sleep with her on the battlefield. He takes her back to his home, and there's a process that they go through in order for her to become his wife. The Gemara asks, can a priest, can a Kohen take an Eshet Yifat Toar? So Rav says yes, Shmuel says no. Or maybe they all agree that he can take her and have relations with her once, but afterwards he cannot. Again, the Gemara explains why this is okay. It talks about the fact that the Torah recognizes people's base desires, their yetzer hara, and therefore allows this to go on within a certain framework. Again, I think that this is a little troubling, or maybe a lot troubling to people. I think it is important to recognize that what happens on a battlefield in all other nations is much, much worse. And the fact that the Torah says that, a person can take one woman and has to make sure that he really wants her and goes through an entire process, I think is a way to control the army, right? And that they cannot go through and rape all the women in the city that they capture. So I think it is interesting to think about. And again, this woman is seen as a convert, and a Kohen is not allowed to marry a convert, and therefore that's why there's a machloket if she can be his wife from then on, if he can sleep with her. Okay. The Eshet Yifat Toar, this woman is only someone that he desires, and he takes her and then he marries her. He can only take, Daf 22 tells us he can only take one woman to be his wife, and when they get home, as I mentioned before, it's only when they get home and not when he on the battlefield. Okay, back to the slave who says he wants to stay. He has to declare that he wants to stay twice. The Gemara says in the beginning and the end. We don't know what the beginning and the end means. The Gemara explains that it doesn't mean the beginning and end of the servitude. It means the beginning of the last hour or the last day, at the beginning of that last hour and at the end of the last hour. And now the Gemara goes through all the verses that are in this topic of the nirtza, the slave who says he has to stay. And based on all the verses, there are very specific guidelines. So the Gemara explains that the master has to have a wife and children in order for the slave to stay, because it says that the slave has to say, I loved you and your household. So there needs to be a household, which means a wife and children. The slave also has to have a wife and children. Again, this is all based on the verses. The master needs to love him, meaning want him to stay. The slave has to love the master. Both the master and the slave have to be in the same health condition, meaning both healthy or maybe even both ill, because it has to be the same. It says, Ki tov lo imach. It is good for you with him. As we mentioned before, you have to feed the servant the same food and drink. You have to sleep on the same type of bed, right? The servant cannot sleep in the barn with the animals. He has to sleep on the same type of bed. And therefore, the Gemara says that if you buy a Jewish slave, you're actually buying a master for yourself. I think this is a very powerful statement, and very different of the way we understand slavery. Right here, the person is treated in the utmost respect, and therefore it is very complicated. Not only that, but the master has to support the servant's children and his wife, right, that he left at home. And now let's say he wants to stay because life is good. So the master has to put the slave by the door, and he pierces his ear till he puts him by the doorpost and till the metal hits the door, meaning all the way through. And the Gemara explains what's the symbolism here. The symbolism is that the ear that heard God say at Har Sinai that we are God's servants and that we shouldn't serve anybody else is the ear that's going to be pierced, meaning you're not listening to what I said, and therefore that ear is going to be pierced. Why is it at the doorpost? So the similar idea, right? The door and the doorpost that witnessed God passing over the Jewish homes, right, in Egypt, right? Passover, right? Pesach, right? When I took you out and I told you that you're going to be my servant and no one else's, says God, right? The servant needs to be pierced in front of those doorposts. Okay, next Mishnah on Daf 22 talks about the non-Jewish slave. This is called the Eved Knaani, right? Canaan is the Canaanites, a nation that lived in Israel when the Jewish people came in, but it means any non-Jewish slave. He is bought with money, a document, a shtar, or with chazaka. Chazaka means some sort of proprietary act. And it's just interesting to understand that this non-Jewish slave, when he is bought, he has to do a brit milah and go circumcision, and he's put in the mikvah, in the ritual water, and he becomes obligated to keep certain commandments, certain mitzvot, just like a woman, meaning not time-bound mitzvot. It's interesting that he becomes Jewish in a sense. When he goes free, he becomes completely Jewish, but when he is owned, he's seen as on his way to being Jewish. How does he go free? If someone buys his freedom, or he gets a get shichrur, a document of emancipation, or he can buy his own freedom and he gets the get shichrur from others. Okay, now the Gemara is going to explain this. The non-Jewish slave is linked to the ancestral field like we did before, but now literally across the board. Therefore, it is acquired, he's acquired like the field, but he doesn't go free for Yovel on the Jubilee year. He is owned forever. He can also be bought with a different type of acquisition, with the kinyan chalipin. If you remember, we discussed that last time, where you lift up an item, and that is a way of acquiring something that is not in front of you, where we exchange articles. It's not mentioned in the Mishnah because it's an acquisition for movable objects as well. Therefore, it wasn't mentioned. He can also be acquired through what's called mishicha. And we're going to learn different mechanisms of acquisition, which is called a kinyan, right, an acquisition. So one is called mishicha. Mishicha means to pull something, right? So if I want to buy something, if I pull it towards me, it shows that I own it. However, hauling the sleeve is not enough. You have to actually pull him physically. Now the Gemara says, wait a minute, but I know that mishicha, pulling, is also if I call an object. Let's say I buy an animal and I say, here, boy, come, and it comes to me. That's called mishicha, and that's valid. The Gemara asks, why doesn't that work for a slave? And the Gemara explains, right, that a slave moves on his own accord, whereas an animal just moves to whoever calls him. Therefore, it's not comparable. We also said that you can do a proprietary act, a chazaka. What does this mean? That if the slave does an act of servitude to the master or for the master, so then it shows that he is the slave. So the Gemara describes, right, different things. If you put on his shoes, if you take off his shoes, right, again, this is the slave to the master. If the master lifts up the slave, literally, like lifts him up, or if the slave lifts up the master, this is called hagbaha. This is another form of kinyan, of acquisition. This is actually the highest form of, or the best form of acquisition. Daf 23, if a convert dies and he doesn't leave any heirs, so then all his possessions are ownerless and anyone can acquire them, even the slaves. As we said, the non-Jewish slave, the Eved Ivri, can acquire himself with money that he takes from someone else. Why is that important? Because as soon as the non-Jewish slave acquires the money, so then it already becomes the master's, and then he can't buy himself. So it has to be money from somebody else. Now, you can't, right, buy him or free him without his knowledge, because there's a concept in the Gemara, which is I can do something positive or advantageous for somebody when I'm not with them, right, without their consent, right? If I know you're giving me, something very precious to give to somebody else, I know they're going to want that, so I can acquire it for them. The term in the Gemara is zachin le'adam shelo befanav. If it's a zchut, if it's something meritorious, if something good, I can do it without your consent for you. But if it's not for him, if it's not good for him, I can't do it, right? So I can't accept, a parking ticket for somebody else because they're not going to want that parking ticket. So here the Gemara talks about, is it good for the slave to be freed or not? And that's going to be a discussion throughout this Gemara, because on one hand, as we saw, life is good or seemingly good. On the other hand, we would imagine that people want to be free. So the Gemara says, for the non-Jewish slave, he'd rather be a slave than be free. Therefore, you can only free him with his knowledge. Okay, shtar, what's this document? When he gets it in his hand, he acquires his hand and his freedom at the same time. We saw this in Masechet Gitin as well. Or maybe you can buy the slave without his knowledge. Again, maybe here we say that it is good for him to be freed, but for a document, it's only with his consent. Then the Mishnah has another opinion that the Chachamim, the sages, say he can only be free with his own money. They say that it is good for him to be freed. Therefore, you can do it without his consent. Therefore, the money can be his own or somebody else's. For the document, it can only be someone else's. Right? You put the document in someone else's hand, not in the hand of the slave, and that's how he becomes free. The Gemara teaches us that a slave can appoint an agent to accept his document of emancipation, just like a woman, we know, can appoint an agent to get her get. And since we're talking about agents or agency, the Gemara asks, priests, Kohanim, right, are the agents of God for us and not our agents to work for God, right? Because they can do things that we can't. Therefore, they can't be our agents if we can't do the things that they are doing. Okay. Everyone agrees that anything a slave or a wife acquires becomes the master's or the husband's. If someone gave the slave something and said, this is for you on condition that you don't give it to your master, there's a machloket if it works or not. Another opinion is that everyone agrees that the master cannot acquire it because of that condition. But if someone gives money and says, this is to free you, so then it's a machloket if it works or not. Okay, daf 24. If a person gives money to a woman and says, right, on condition that you redeem your husband's maaser sheni, right, the tithe that needs to, that again, the maaser sheni is a tithe that you take the money and you go to Jerusalem to eat it. If the person themselves redeems it, they have to add a fifth. So here the question is, when the wife redeems it, is she like the husband and therefore needs to add a fifth, or is she her own person in the sense of legally, and therefore when she redeems it, she does not have to add a fifth? So let's say a person gave money and said, I want you to redeem it and not add a fifth. The question is, does that work or not? Or maybe the case is that the tithe, the maaser sheni, is from her father's house, meaning it's really hers, and it isn't acquired by the husband, and therefore she doesn't have to add the fifth. We said, okay, so the non-Jewish slave goes free if the master injures him. So here the Gemara discusses what's the injury. If he knocks out his tooth or his eye, right? Shen v'ayin, right? His tooth or his eye. And the Gemara adds, or he injures the tip of any one of his limbs, because like the tooth and the eye, they do not regenerate and they are exposed. So too, the tips of any limb. So the Gemara says, not if it's a baby tooth, right? Because that does regenerate, meaning it grows back, not back, but another tooth will grow. We say that he goes free, but maybe he still needs a document of emancipation, or maybe no, he doesn't need it. This is learned from the wife, right? She always needs a get. Therefore, the slave also always needs a document to show that he was set free. Let's say the master hits the slave's eye or ear. So we said he goes free. Let's say he hits the wall next to the eye or the ear, and there's some sort of like shock, and the slave loses sight or hearing. So the question is, does he go free or not? The Gemara says he does not go free. Right? Noise is not damage in this sense. However, in other cases, it is. If he weakens the eye or loosens the tooth, the slave can still use it, so he doesn't go free. If he can't use it, so then he does go free. If it was, let's say, already loose, and then the master knocks it out, if he could use it beforehand, and now it's knocked out, so then he goes free, and if not, then no. If the master was a doctor or a dentist, and he tries to heal the slave, but he ends up causing blindness or the tooth to come out, right? He tried to heal him, but it doesn't work. He still goes free because it's not about his attention, it's about the effect. Or no, we look at the intention and we say that the intention was good and therefore the slave does not go free. What happens if the slave was blind already and then the master pulls out his eye? So then he goes free because that is a worse blemish. Just the top of 25 will finish this idea. If the slave, we said if you lose a limb, let's say the slave had 6 fingers, and then the master cuts off one of his fingers, so then he goes free. But that's only if the 6 fingers were in line. But if the 6th finger is on the back of his hand, so then he doesn't go free because it's not counted as part of his hand. With that, we are going to end today's lesson. I'll open it up for if anybody has any questions. Next week, just an announcement that next week we're going to have class on Tuesday instead of Wednesday. So just to be aware, I'll send out an email on Monday, Bezrat Hashem, to tell you about that class. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording, and then if anybody has any questions, feel free to ask.